Welcome to the Professional Diploma in Web Development. If you've always had a keen interest in full-stack web development, then you've come to the right place. This course has been designed for both beginners as well as experienced web developers who seek a practical approach to web development. In this course, we learn all the fundamentals of web development and learn to code from scratch. We'll begin by installing and exploring our scripting environment, after which we'll move on to programming languages of the web. Now, this includes HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even PHP. We'll cover both front-end and back-end technology stacks. Throughout the course, we'll develop a bunch of interactive web applications that you can add to your profile to strengthen your credibility as a full-stack web developer. From responsive e-commerce applications, style booking systems, and even HR systems, rest assured that this will be a hands-on course. As a bonus, you will also learn all about SQL databases and how to integrate them into your website. In today's lesson, you will be introduced to CSS as a styling language. This will give you an idea of how we go about styling our bare-bone website to something more appealing for our end users. CSS is also the most popular styling language out there when it comes to web development and is capable of dramatically improving the usability of a website. So stay tuned because things are going to become a lot more colorful. Now, in today's lesson, lesson 6, we'll be covering an introduction to CSS. And as we progress throughout this module, we will be doing more complex things in CSS. But without further ado, let's have a look at what's in store for today's lesson. So in today's lesson, the first thing we're going to have a look at is what CSS is. And here we will essentially just define CSS. We'll have a look at some of the characteristics of CSS, and we'll try to understand why it's so powerful and why it's so much of the preferred styling language when it comes to web development among web developers. Moving on, we'll then have a look at working with pseudo classes. And pseudo classes is a really neat tool when it comes to providing your elements with state management. And this includes things like hovering over a button, clicking down on a button or a navigation link, or just styling a navigation bar with state management in mind. Okay. And then we'll also have a look at approaches to styling. Now, there are 3 different approaches to styling when it comes to CSS. And we will have a look at all 3 of them, but keep in mind there's only one that we will use moving forward. So the idea is to show you all the bad practices and the best practice in terms of how do we style. Okay. And then lastly, we'll be working with fonts, which is going to be very, very basic. But at the end of the session, what I really want to get to is showing you how to link your CSS document with your actual HTML document. So without further ado, let's dive in. Before we get started though, did you know that CSS was first proposed by Hakum William Lee on October 10, 1994. At the time, he was working very closely with Tim Berners-Lee, and if you remember correctly, Tim Berners-Lee was sort of the inventor of the World Wide Web. So it kind of makes sense if you think about it. The creator of CSS as well as the web work closely together to actually bring us this very, very powerful technology called CSS and HTML. Wonderful. Now that we've sort of covered all the admin, I think it's time we jump right into our very first topic. So then, what is CSS? Well, also known as cascading style sheets, CSS is a style sheet language used for describing the presentation of a document written in a markup language. Now, although most often used to set the visual style of a web page and the user interfaces as well when it comes to HTML, the language can be used to render various other media formats, and this includes things such as images, animations, colors, videos, and what have you. Essentially, I want you to think about it like this. If HTML is our skeleton, which is just the structure of our web page or website, CSS adds the meat and makes our skeleton look pretty. Okay, so it's another layer on top of the stack when it comes to web development. Pretty straightforward, right? So then what are some of the characteristics when it comes to CSS? Well, first of all, when it comes to various device sizes or the actual screen size of a device, CSS allows computing devices to display every website differently or every web page differently. I refer to this as responsiveness. So a small screen on a mobile device is not going to look exactly the same as that of a laptop or desktop computer. Okay. Furthermore, it also enables the separation of presentation when it comes to content, and this includes things such as the layout, the colors, the fonts, the borders, and what have you. Okay, and then also it improves content accessibility, and this goes back to the very first point we made. If you can accommodate various devices, you can actually reach a larger user base for your website or your web platform. And then it also uses selectors in order to target HTML elements. And remember, selectors are kind of like when we worked with our IDs and our classes, when we had to use our hashtags as well as the full stops. So I'm going to show you an example of a selector and the way we actually lay it out properly in a second. And this brings us to our very last point, where we have declaration blocks. Now, to use CSS to target certain attributes, we have to declare a block or a declaration block, and then make changes to that declaration block depending on what we're trying to change within our element. Lovely. Now let's have a look at an example of a declaration block. And what we have over here is a simple declaration block with an H1 selector, which brings us to our first point. So the selector in this declaration block is our H1 tag or element that we are manipulating or changing. So this element, all H1 tags in our web page, we are formatting it accordingly. Okay. So in essence, a selector points to the HTML element that you want to style. In this case, again, it's our H1 tag. Then we have our full declaration block. Now, the declaration block here is everything inside of the curly brace, from the opening curly brace up until the end. And generally, this contains one or more declarations separated by a semicolon. So there are various attributes that we can manipulate in one declaration block. Okay, very important to remember. And this brings us to attributes. Now, attributes is something we've been working with when we've worked with borders, the colors and those kind of things. These are all attributes, okay? They are a property of an element. In this case, we are targeting the color of the H1 tag as well as the font size of the H1 tag. Then we are providing it with a value, which is our very last point. And the value we are setting the color of this H1 tag to is blue. And the font size we're setting it to is 12 pixels. And that is the value. Now, besides the H1 tag, here is some common examples of other selectors that we could use. And in our first one, we have a class. We reference this as we've done before with a full stop. And in this example, we've got a class with the name of container. And this selects all elements with a class name of container. So many items with the same class name container would be styled accordingly. Next, we have the ID, and we reference this using the hashtag. And here we've given this element ID of student number. Okay, and this selects an element, not all, an element, which means a unique element, one and only one element, with a uniquely identifiable ID of student number. And then we also have this thing called element. Now, this is just a very, very generic name, and much like the example before where we had the H1, we select all H1 tags and we style it accordingly. So this is going to take every single H1 tag in our website and style it differently, or style it exactly the same. Okay, then we have this thing called element, comma element. Now this is slightly different, because what we are doing here is we're selecting all the div tags, right? In this example, we're saying div, comma p. So we're selecting all the div tags and all the p tag elements. Okay, so we are taking several elements and we are styling them accordingly. This is different from using a class, okay? And then we have element without the comma. And here we are saying take the navigation list. So we've got a nav and a list item. And we're saying select all the list items inside of the navigation element. So we are not styling the navigation element. We are styling the list items inside the navigation element, okay? And then we have element plus element. And here we have a div plus h2. And this selects all H2 elements that are placed immediately after div elements. So if we have any H2 elements that are placed after we've created a div element, for example, then we would be styling the H2 element and not the div element. Now, that can be a mouthful. It's always best to see these things in a practical example, and I will show you as we progress through this module. Wonderful. Now moving on to our next topic, working with pseudo classes. And pseudo classes, like I said, is a really neat way to manage states of your actual elements. So what exactly is a pseudo class then? Well, a pseudo class is used to define a special state of an element, and elements, much like objects in the real world, can maintain different states. Typical example I can give you here is a car can be on or off. It could be running or it could just be off. You could turn a light bulb on or off. You as a human being could be sitting or standing or laying. You can exist in different states. And just like we can exist in different states as objects, the same applies to elements, okay? So why do we opt for pseudo classes in the first place? Well, first of all, it enables improved navigation for end users. And if you think about visiting links in a navigation bar, when you visit certain links, a link might initially be blue and then turn purple afterwards. That signifies to the user that you've visited this link. So there's visual cue information when it comes to using pseudo classes. Apart from this, it also conveys meaning to selected elements inside of your website. And again, hovering over a button will let you know if you have clicked on the button, or if you're just hovering over the button, and all of those kind of things. Okay, and then lastly, this ties down to both previous points. It enhances the user interface, because if your user interface speaks to the user, lets your user know what's happening in terms of responses, then the user would be they would feel more comfortable navigating your website. Wonderful. Now here we have an example of a pseudo class model. Now I am not going to be going into detail with this. This is just to give you a visual representation of how pseudo classes work. We first have the first child, then here we have an example of a link pseudo class, and a link would either be visited or not visited. We can also have objects that maintain dynamic pseudo class code, where if you hover over it, it will change a different color, it will grow larger. The link or the button can be active. There's also this thing called focus. And again, this doesn't really mean much without seeing everything in action. Okay, I just wanted to show you what the model looks like for pseudo classes in web development. And here's an example of a couple of classes that we can use when it comes to pseudo classes. Now let's actually just sprint through this, because we don't want to be spending too much time with our tables. Okay, so first we have the active pseudo class, and in this example we have an anchor tag with an active pseudo class attached to it, and this selects the active link. Okay, pretty straightforward. We have the hover class, which allows us to let the user know that they are hovering over the anchor tag and it changes a different color, for example. We have the link, which takes the anchor tag and selects all unvisited links. Then we have the visited class, and this, when we associate it with the anchor tag, selects all the visited links out there. And then we have the focus, which we can use with an input tag. So if we use the focus with an input tag, it selects the input element which has focus. And then we have checked, which selects every checked input element that is visible on our web page. And then we have disabled, which selects all the disabled fields, for example, like your input tags. And then we have the first child, and here we have a slightly different approach, because here we're using a paragraph tag associated with the first child class. And this selects all p tags, or selects every p tag or element that is the first child of its parent. Again, sounds like a mouthful, but it's really not that complicated. And then lastly, we have invalid, where we are taking an input we associate it with an invalid pseudo class, and this selects all input elements with an invalid value. Now for our next topic, approaches to styling in CSS. And this is going to be extremely important, because in our tiny little practical that we'll be doing today, I want to show you how to approach the different kinds of styling methods. So when it comes to the different styles of approaching, there are essentially three. First, there is external styling, there's also internal styling, and then lastly, there is inline styling. Now, just as a heads up, we will always be using external styling in future after this lesson, but we will have a demonstration of how to go about doing it internally as well as using inline styling. But first, let's unpack external styling. So when it comes to external styling, here's an example. And external styling is considered best practice for most web development projects, because it allows developers to change the styling of your entire website from one single document, as opposed to having multiple documents where you're applying your styling. Now, in this typical example here, what we have is this thing called pos body, and we've styled that with a margin of 0. We have a pos wrapper that we've styled, and we've got a pos wrapper 2 we've styled. Now, each of these elements can exist anywhere inside of our website, but the styling will be applied using one single document. And that's why we always use external styling as a best practice. And here's an example of internal styling. And when it comes to internal styling, we embed the CSS code at the very top of our document between our head tags. Okay, so when we use this approach, we have to use the style tag when creating our internal styling approach. And a typical example here is that all of this here that you see between our style tags, our opening and closing style tags, this is all CSS code. Very, very importantly though, this code is embedded between the head tags in the beginning of our HTML document. Now with internal styling, if you do take this approach, you will have to create CSS code for each web page that you create inside of your website, which is not necessarily clean and effective, because if you make changes in one place, you might have to make changes in various other places. Typical example again, if you want your headings to be uniform across all your web pages, you would have to then create your CSS code inside each and every web page to get that uniform sort of flow of your headings. And then lastly, we have inline styling. Now, when it comes to inline styling, we embed the styling code within each of the elements we create as we create them. And here's an example of a couple of them. Right at the bottom, actually, we've got this h2 tag, and we've styled this tag with the styling code inside of the opening tag. Now, this is probably the worst approach when it comes to inline styling, but it's only used if you want to override the code in your external style sheet. Okay. Now, again, this is not a good approach for the very same reason the previous one is not a good approach, because if you want that uniformity across your website, you would have to go and change every single heading of heading 2 size, for example, to sort of meet that uniform standard. And that could take a hell of a lot of time. Also, much like any other programming or coding language out there, you can also make comments in your CSS code. And we do this for the same reasons that we would do it in any other programming language, except for maybe with CSS, there's some author documentation that you want to include, such as your name, your address, your company name, and all of those kind of things. But for the most part, you include comments so that you can show other developers what you are using or what you are doing in your code. And here's a couple of examples. If we want to comment in CSS, we must use the following notation, where we have a slash with an asterisk, your comment, or with another asterisk with another slash. Okay, your comment needs to be in between the two asterisks. And an example here would be these 3 comments that we have over here, or these several comments that we have over here. In the first one, we just have a basic comment that says, "This is my first style sheet." Then we have several others, such as hard-coded height, use first and then remove. Then we have height set to 120 pixels, shorthand for updating. Okay. Again, this is just comments to allow the other developers to see what you are doing with your code. Remember, when it comes to commenting, this does not get rendered out to the client or to the front end at all. So it's not visible to the user at any point. So then how do we go about creating a link between our style sheet and our HTML document? Well, it's fairly simple. In order to link an externally created style sheet, we must use the link tag in between the head tag in the beginning of our HTML document. And here's a very basic example at the bottom where we have a opening head tag. Then inside of that, we've got a link tag. And inside the link tag, very, very importantly, we must specify the relationship attribute and set the path as to where the style sheet is laying. Okay. Now this specifies the relationship between the HTML document and the CSS document. So it's just to say, hey, in my head tag, here's this link element or this link tag, and the relationship between the HTML document and this style sheet or this document is that this is my CSS document used to style my website. Now, before we close things off with our final topic today, let's have a look at what's coming up in our next lesson, lesson 7. In our next lesson, we will discuss the CSS box model and learn all about how we can use padding, margin, and borders to style our elements. This will greatly improve the layout and dimensions of our elements, and we'll also learn all about positioning our styled elements in a single viewport. To wrap things up, we'll put everything together that we've learned so far into practice when it comes to CSS. And that brings us to our very final topic in today's lesson, which is working with fonts in CSS. And you might think this is quite trivial, but it's quite important when it comes to choosing the right fonts for your web pages. Now, when it comes to working with fonts, essentially we are referring to the fact that it is a typography, which is the art of designing the appearance of characters and letters on a web page. Now, we tend to use things like text characters, which is the base of our fonts, and they define the style and the appearance of each of the characters in the alphabet. So by default, most websites use Times New Romans, actually, if you think about it. And this can be overridden by using CSS, where we can choose a multitude of other fonts available to us. And we can essentially alter our fonts by simply using the font family attribute in our CSS code. Now, here is a couple of examples of some fonts that we can safely use in the web development process without having to do any sort of workaround. Now, we don't have to go through all of these, but there are some familiar ones here that you might find in Microsoft Word, for example, such as Arial, Calibra, Impact, and so on. Now, much like we can choose on a style for our fonts, we can also scale our fonts accordingly, and we can choose between either an absolute size or a relative size. Now, let's unpack the two and discuss them in broader detail. Now, when it comes to absolute font sizes, we must keep in mind there are several things that we must consider when developing a website. First of all, using absolute values sets the text to a specific size that can essentially not be changed later on, and this is bad for user experience reasons, okay, because not all devices have the same screen size, for example. And then lastly, this is only a useful approach when we know the devices that we are targeting. So if we know our website has been built specifically for desktops or laptops, for example, then we would opt for something like an absolute size. And when we use absolute size, we use values like pixels or PT. Now, on the other hand, we can also opt for relative font size scaling. And when it comes to relative, it's a lot better when it comes to mobile responsiveness because it sets the size of the text relative to the surrounding elements, and it also takes into consideration the viewport or the size of the screen, which is ideal for mobile responsiveness. Keep in mind, most people these days access the internet or the web using their mobile phones. And then lastly, it also allows the developer to change the text size with different browsers, because remember, all clients or browsers are not exactly the same. They are not made equal. So this is another important factor to keep in mind. So let's have a look at examples of what absolute font sizes would look like. And absolute font sizes, we generally tend to use pixel values. And in this example, we have two header tags, a header 1 and a header 2, as well as a paragraph tag at the bottom. And we essentially set the font size attribute to 40 pixels, 30 pixels, and 14 pixels respectively. Now remember, regardless of the device, and no matter how much you rotate your mobile device, for example, these values are not going to change because they are absolute. They are fixed and hard-coded as such. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we also have relative font sizes. And here things work slightly differently. There's actually a formula to this. So when setting font sizes using the EM size, instead of the pixels, it enables users to resize the text depending on their device. So the value is not hard-coded as it is worth using pixels, for example. So 1 EM is essentially equal to 16 pixels, and that's how we can convert these values. So we've got exactly the same thing here, where we've got an H1 tag, we've got an H2 tag, and we have a paragraph tag. And we've given them each various EM values, and we have a formula associated with these values to better understand how we can scale them using EMs as opposed to pixels. So let's have a look at a very brief example between the different relative and absolute units that we can actually use in the web development space to resize our text. So much like EM, we can also use percentage as a unit, which is also very responsive when it comes to text. So according to this kind of approach, your text will be scaled up or scaled down depending on the user's device and the screen size. Okay, and it's much easier on the visitors or the users visiting your website because you don't want to flood them with bold and massive text when it comes to using absolute values. Okay, so it's a lot more scalable to either use the EM approach or the percentage approach. And in our example over here, our code example, what we have is font size EM1, 12, 16px, as well as 100%. And then we've got two examples of body text where we've increase the font size from 100% to 120%. Now, what I want you to take note of here is that 1 EM, when scaled up to 120%, can become bigger, as well as when we use the percentage unit. However, when we use PT and pixels, that value is hard-coded, so it's not going to scale up and it's not going to scale down. Okay, so again, like I mentioned before, there is a formula to this. And think about it like this: 1 EM is equal to 12 PT, which is also equal to 16 PX, which is essentially equal to 100% of the default font size. So that is a lot to take in. I think it's about time that we actually put all of this into practice, and let's start coding. Now, before we get started with our practical, let's have a look at what we're actually going to be working towards. And essentially, we're going to be continuing from our previous project where we built out this login page where you could view cars as well as a race between two specific cars, the Toyota Supra as well as the BMW M2 competition pack. And you'll notice a slight bit of change just off the bat. You'll notice that our headings are slightly different. You'll notice that our visited links are colored differently as well. And then there are a couple of other things, like when you're actually hovering over an image, the border changes, the radius. You'll notice it's a little soft on the edges, and the border scales up to a larger size as well as the image, and the color of the border turns to green. Okay, apart from this, if we actually go visit the log out page, you'll notice some similar changes. Our headings are also different, the links are still different, and we have this background that's highlighted when we focus on our input fields over here that changes to the color green. And when hovering over this button, you've got this slight transition effect where the login turns to white and the button itself turns to orange. Now, without further ado, let's dive in and start working towards this project. So first things first, I'm going to boot up Atom. Okay, and once I've got Atom open, I'm just going to copy and paste the previous project that we worked with, because we are going to be tweaking this project. So if we head over here, I'm going to copy this, because all our resources from our previous project should be here. Your images might be different from mine. That's okay. Do not stress. Actually, we can just delete this and then just copy. Let's say copy and then paste. Should make a copy of that, and I'll rename this to L6 because we are currently on lesson 6. Wonderful stuff. So let's make sure we've got all our files, we've got the M2, we've got everything we essentially need. Great stuff. So now I can move on to actually opening up Atom, and I'm going to open this project as a folder. Okay, so I'm going to say open folder, and I'm going to head over to my desktop over here, my Shore sandbox, and I'm going to select this entire folder, select folder, and it's going to open up all my resources on the side. Now, remember, when we started styling a couple of things, initially we styled using this approach. Now, this approach that we initially styled with is called internal styling. How do we know this? Because everything is sitting between the opening and closing head tag. Okay, so we don't really have to go through all of this again. What I do want to show you though is that we can also sort of work with inline styling, but again, it's bad practice. Now, when it comes to internal styling, if we wanted to style our login page as well as the drag race page, we'd have to go and create a style block for each and every one of those HTML documents, which is not best practice, okay, as we discussed before. Now, we haven't really touched base with inline styling much. I'm going to show you a very simple example over here. So in my index file, let's actually open this up. Okay, so everything is as is. I'm going to change this over here. I'm going to change the border color of this, and I'm going to change the border type of this image over here. And to do that, I can just head back over. I'm going to find that picture, and that picture is here, super. And then I'm going to add a style tag. Okay, and in the style tag, I'm going to say border color. This is also an attribute. There are a ton of attributes out there that you can actually use. You can actually check them out on W3 Schools if you want to find out all the attributes for the various elements. I'm going to change this to red, save that, make sure everything's working correctly. I'll refresh this, and that's how we style inline. Okay, we'll style within the element itself, okay, that we create. I'm going to take this a step further. I'm going to add a semicolon here, and then I'm going to say border, because I want to style two attributes. I'm going to say border style, and I'm going to go here and say this is dashed. Okay, so open up, refresh, and now I've got this dash. Now, again, if we wanted to style every single image across various pages, we would have to write this code out for every single image that we want to apply the styling to. Again, this is not the way we're going to be doing things. This is called inline styling. Okay, so we've covered inline styling, and we've covered internal styling as well, which is all of this over here. Now let's have a look at how we can work with external styling, which is best practice and the way we are going to use moving forward. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file first of all in this L6 over here. I'm going to say new folder, and I'm just going to call this CSS for now. Okay, so this is sitting inside of my folder that I just created. Let's verify that. So Shore sandbox, let's head over here, and there we go. We've got this thing CSS. Great stuff. I noticed that I'm sitting with a copy of something. Oh, it's deleted. Must have been a bug. Okay, so let's just make sure we are here. I'll minimize this, and now I'm going to create inside of this folder. Make sure that your arrow is pointing down, okay, so that it's open, or you can even right click on this. And I'm going to say new file, and I'm going to call this one style sheet .css. Very, very important. We must add the .css notation at the end, or the format or the extension, so that it's recognized as a CSS document. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just sticking to style sheet because that's how I normally name my style sheets. Okay, and then I will click enter. That will be saved. Now, what I want you to take note of is all of the code we initially had, I'm going to remove. Okay, so I'm going to cut that out, and I don't need this anymore, so I'm going to just close that off. Okay, I'll save that, and I'm going to head back over. Before I do anything else, let's head back over to the browser and see what's happening. Now everything is in its default state. Okay, our border is back to black, our image is much larger, and so on. Now this is not what I want, so let's just clean this up. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to, in my style sheet, that code that I copied or cut out, I'm going to just simply paste it in here. And that's it. Now we have an external style sheet that's going to control all the changes we make to our HTML document over here. So you might think this is going to work perfectly fine, but look at that. Nothing is happening. It's actually still in its default state. There is something that's missing here. And I want you to take a second, think about it, and see if you can figure it out. Wonderful. So if you figured it out, what we should have been doing is we need to link our style sheet, because there is no way that these two documents are currently communicating. And how do we do that? In our head tag over here, we can simply just say link. Okay, and it's asking for relationship. So this relationship attribute is just saying that, well, the link between this and our style sheet is that the document we're referencing is actually a style sheet. Okay, and then in our href here, we have to get the path correctly. Now, because if you noticed, what we did was we created a folder inside of our L6 folder over here, right? So this folder is sitting one level sort of above these files. Okay, so we can't just go and say stylesheet.css. We need to reference the folder, and then we need to reference the style sheet inside of here. I'll just go back. So I'm going to say css/style sheet.css. Very, very important. Get the .css notation correct the first time. You shouldn't have any issues. Now, if I refresh now, all should be good and well. And there we go. Voila, back to our original state. And essentially, the only thing we did was we copied or cut the code from our HTML document, created a style sheet, and we added that code to the style sheet over here. Wonderful. Now let's do a couple of complex things that we've learned throughout all the theory. Okay, and the first thing I want to do is I maybe want to just give I want to use a pseudo class. Let's go with a pseudo class. Okay, so I'm going to take this code with the supra over here, and I'm going to reference that supra again. So I'm going to say supra, but this time colon, and I'm going to say hover. So what I'm saying is this is the default state of the supra, and when I hover over the supra, this is going to be the new state of that supra. Okay, this is called a pseudo class. Keep that in mind. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the code slightly, and I'm going to say, let's go with a width. When hovering over this picture, let's do a width of 720 pixels. And apart from this, we also want the border radius to be slightly more round and soft. So I'm going to give it a border radius of 10 pixels. Let's actually go up to 15 pixels. Maybe it looks a bit better. And lastly, I'm going to add a border color of green. And there's something I want to show you here, a neat trick and something you must know as a web developer. Very, very important. Okay, so let's refresh this. And now if we hover over it, we get this dark green effect, which is not all that great. So how can we make this slightly better looking and more appealing and more soft and bright and allow it to pop a bit more? Well, we can use a hex code for that. Now, what is a hex code? A hex code is just an RGB color or a certain number that represents a color, if you will. Okay, now I'm going to show you a really awesome website that you can actually use to get hex codes. Okay, and the website that we're going to be using is called Color Hexer. So you can just type this in, Color Hexer. Here we go. Okay, that's the URL. You don't need this over here. This is just to get the specific color. That's a URL to a specific color. And here you can essentially select the colors that you want. Okay, I'm going to stick with green and I'm going to go with this one over here. So if you want to grab the hex code for this specific color, you can simply and literally just copy this code over here. See back, and now I'm going to paste that in where I have green, because there are default colors that are hard coded, but if you want flexibility, it's always best to use hex codes. Okay, so I'll save that, head back over, refresh, and I've got this brighter green which goes nice with that bright blue that we have. Okay, beautiful. So next I'm going to do exactly the same for the BMW, but instead of having to type everything out from scratch, I'm just going to copy and paste my code. So with a super code, I'm going to paste that over here, and I'm just going to rename this to M2. Okay, because that's the ID associated with our M2. If we go over here, we can see the ID associated with our Supra is Supra, and at the bottom, our ID for our BMW is the M2 code over here. Okay, so let's refresh, and now we've got that effect for both images. Wonderful stuff. Now, the next thing I essentially want to do is I might want to just add my headings. I could change if I wanted to, but I'm going to change my links. So these links over here, right, we want to signify that this one has been visited. Currently we know this because cause is in purple. So if we click on login, login is going to turn to purple as well. But to change this, what we can do is we can use another pseudo class called visited. Okay, so at the bottom over here, I'm going to call all anchor tags. Now you'll notice here, I'm not referencing an ID. I'm not referencing a class either. I'm referencing all anchor tags simply by just typing A. So open curly brace. But what I want to do is add the visited hover class to this. And let's just give this a bit of space. And when visited, I want the color of that text to be orange. Okay, close that off. Come back, refresh, and there we go. Now we can see our visited anchor tags signify that it has been visited, but instead of purple, it's now orange. Next, I might want to go and work with my heading tags. So all my heading 1 tags, let's just check them out throughout my website. My heading 1 tag over here is cause. My heading 1 tag for my login form, well, it's heading 2, so we need to change this to 1. So I'll just change that, 1 and 1, okay? So that I can take effect for all headings, okay? So head back over to my style sheet and I'm going to say all H1 tags, right? I want you to have a font family. Remember we spoke about font families and the types of fonts that we can use that are safe. For this one, I'm going to go Arial Black. So I'll say Arial Black. Close that off, save it up, hit back over. Now notice what's going to happen over here. This is going to change to a different font, okay? Refresh, and now we've got this more bold sort of look. But there's an issue here. It's not working with my login page, and I said all heading tags, okay? Even my anchor tags are not working correctly. And again, there's only one reason for this, and this is something that a lot of developers sort of overlook, especially when you start coding. To fix this, what I can do is I can literally just go and copy that link relationship, because this index page is linked to my style sheet, but you'll notice in my login page, well, there's absolutely nothing here. So what I can do is I can take that exact same line of code, as long as this HTML file and my login file are sitting in the same folder with the same level and the same paths, it's going to work just fine. And that is the case because we can see it over here. Let's just collapse that. And in my heading or my head tag over here, copy paste that, save it up, hit back over, and there we go. We have that exact same effect. Now, this is the power in using external style sheets, okay? This particular style approach. And again, it all boils down to the fact that instead of having multiple style sheets or multiple inline stylings, you can have one style sheet to manage all pages in your website. So if I open this, I'll notice that both my cause and my login page are just fine. I'm going to do the exact same for the view days page. So drag this. The only thing I have to do here is I'm not going to be making any changes here. I'm just going to add the relationship. And there we go. So if I back over and on my view days page, exactly the same thing happens. Wonderful. So now I've got great consistency across our entire website. So what's next then? Well, I might want to just work on the buttons, okay? And to do that, let's hit back over. Let's actually close one of this off. We don't need it. The only button I have is in my login form over here. And you'll notice everything is pretty much stock standard. All right. So I'm going to hit back over here. And I'm going to say, let's go, login page. And I'm going to give my button an ID first of all. So I'm going to say ID and call this submit btn for button. Okay. Now I can call that button in my style sheet, and I'm going to essentially just say submit. Actually, I need to add a hashtag because it is a ID. So submit -btn curly brace. Okay. And when hovering over this button, I want to change the state. So on hovering, I want the background color of this button to be orange. And I want the text. And very, very important, the attribute we call here for the text inside the button is the color. Okay. So I'm going to say this needs to be white. Okay. Save that. Hit back over. And now if we hover over our button, first refresh, we get this transition. Okay, so now we've added some sort of visual cue to the user, or signify to the user that you are hovering over this button. Okay, there is so much that you can do. You can even add transition and actual animations to this thing, and that's something we need to do at a later stage when we work with animations in CSS. Now the only thing we need to change here is the fields over here. Okay, and there is this special class for input fields that we can use, and it's not hover, it's not active or visited. In fact, it's called focus. So all input tags, not just one. All right, let's actually delete this first and say focus. When focusing on any of them, we want the background color of that field to be the same color as its consistency. Let's go to green here. Copy paste that Xcode and save it up. Now if we head back over, now when we focus on these, let's refresh. When we focus on these, we get this different color, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so again, we are just visually signifying to the user, look, there's a bit of change here, your website looks a bit more poppy, and whatever the case is. And the same applies for any other fields that we might have added in our website. Okay, so that is just a sort of basic introduction to CSS. I wanted to keep this short because in our next lesson we are going to be building something a lot more robust and more appealing. And keep in mind, if you do want to follow with the session, I do suggest checking out the summary notes from our previous lesson so that you can get the code so you can work on what we've just done over here. Okay, I will be making the summary notes, or I will be making the code available for this one in the summary notes. So again, be sure to check it out.